Hi. I've been ranting and raving about this off camera to my poor papa, that's my dad, for a long time about this issue. And I sent him a video that CoffeeZilla produced a while back because it speaks to one of two issues that I see on social media in regard to experts and, frankly, when they should shut the hell up. This isn't just me venting some steam that's built up over the last years, but I think points out something helpful for you too. I'd also be curious on your take, so let's hear what CoffeeZilla has to say. And CoffeeZilla is an independent investigator here on the platform if you aren't familiar with his work. And then I'd like to add a whole second half to his view that I think needs to be mentioned as well.
Have you ever listened to a podcast where they're interviewing an expert and suddenly that person starts talking about a topic they know nothing about, but they're spouting off and you're like, why don't you stay in your lane?
So that's the crux of the first issue, but let's listen on. And I'll have his full video linked for you if you're interested.
But I actually think that there is a danger when you are brought on as an expert to quickly go from that objective, accurate guy into someone spouting nonsense very easily. And it's not just like a clear-cut difference, like I'm either objective and accurate or I'm sensationalist and spreading misinformation on purpose. I think there is that, but I think the problem actually lies in there's so much content that needs to be made when you start getting into this like podcasting world that these experts that get brought on are only experts in like half the conversation in maybe 1 hour. And then they run out of things to talk about. They just don't have enough things they're experts in to be objective and truthful about. And so then they start talking about some culture garbage or whatever is in the news, right? Because that's everyone can always comment on that.
So first, my question to you is, have you noticed that yourself? I have. On podcasts like The Diary of a CEO, The Joe Rogan Experience, and many, many others. I think Steven, I think that's the Diary of a CEO's host's name, is a good-hearted person. And I think that Joe is too. I realize that some people might disagree with me on that, but that's what I think. That said, they bring on guests that end up discussing things that they simply aren't educated on. And that's a major problem because the listener was introduced to this guest as an expert. And to CoffeeZilla's point, I think actually his name is Steven too, but I'll just keep referring to him as CoffeeZilla for clarity. The transition from staying within one's area of expertise and gradually allowing yourself to be pulled out is extremely subtle, which makes the audience believe that they're still discussing things that they've studied, and yet they've completely left their domain. This is such a problem. It happens ubiquitously across generalist podcasts. But there's more. CoffeeZilla brings up an example, and I actually disagree with him here, but I'll explain in a minute.
Well, here he is in a clip on this Chris Williamson podcast. The title of the clip is, "What Do Modern Men Want in a Man?" Eric Weinstein. Well, let's remind ourselves what Eric is. He has a PhD in mathematical physics, and he is a hedge fund director, a former hedge fund director. What does he know about modern women? Can anyone explain that?
Masculinity. I have to be very careful as I ask because they certainly respond more than they're supposed to according to modern rules of femininity.
Correct.
But my guess is that it's greatly decreased from the market for masculinity in the 60s, let's say.
What are we talking about? This isn't hedge funds. This isn't mathematics. Eric Weinstein is spouting off about modern date. When's the last time this guy has a modern? What are we doing? Okay, but I don't blame Eric.
See, that's the thing. I do blame Eric. This is where I disagree with Coffee because it's the responsibility of the expert to do one of two things. One, opt out. Literally say, I don't know anything about that, so I can't speak to it. I realize that's difficult to do on a podcast because then the host has to scramble to ask something else, which might be extremely unexpected. I get that it's difficult, but frankly, I don't care. It's necessary. Or two, at a minimum, say, we're getting out of my field of expertise here, so please be aware of that as I say, blah, 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 whatever they're going to end up saying. You have to at least create the distinguishing lines, the breaks between your expertise and the topic. Otherwise, the listener is highly prone to believe everything or almost everything is being spoken on by an expert. Now, if either of those things happen, especially number two, and a listener still chooses to ignore the warning and consider it expertise, then that's on the listener and their bias. But the responsibility still falls on the interviewee. I'm torn on if the host also bears responsibility. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. But what about a science example? Coffee brings up another one, and again, I disagree with him.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, do this every morning to find your happiness or whatever. Okay, so in this 1.5 hour show, they talk about a lot of things. They have this long riff of, well, it's not that long. It's like, 8 minutes long, about where does happiness and meaning come from? We won't go through the whole clip, but it's like, Neil deGrasse Tyson is a physicist. He's a public kind of science educator, promoter. He's not a happiness guru. He's not a philosopher. Nonetheless, he's asked about this. Now, okay, am I saying that experts should only talk about things in their area of core competency? No.
Yes, that's exactly what they should be doing. If you are being invited on a podcast as a guest for your expertise, you should limit the conversation to your expertise. It's a slightly different story if you're on a podcast, I don't know, just to have fun or have a lighthearted conversation. But even then, I'd preface at the beginning that you are not an expert, considering that you're inextricably linked to your expertise if you have a social media following or simply by the nature of your tireless work to become an expert in something.
But it can be very confusing when in a podcast you are just seamlessly going in and out of these topics, right? So you're watching a clip and there's nowhere it signals to the audience like, hey, this is something he knows a lot about, versus he has no idea about this. He's just kind of giving a hot take. And you're just kind of rolling through. It's a whole roller coaster.
That's really what it boils down to. It's up to the expert to not only guide the audience through their expertise when in the weeds of their expertise, but also define the borders of that expertise. But that's just one major problem. And I'm really glad that CoffeeZilla brought it up. But he fails to take it far enough, in my opinion, because there's something more sinister. Do I put sinister music here? There's something more sinister, more devilish, more... Okay, I'm exaggerating, but you get the point. It's also bad. And that is supposed experts with a big emphasis on supposed, using snake oil salesman techniques, at least that's what I think, to smoothly navigate the waters of an interview with someone who doesn't know which questions to ask and where to push back appropriately. By the way, do you have a drink with you? Do you have a snack or something? Because I have a lot to say here, so you might want to get comfortable. The second half of this really boils down to the people who are pseudo-experts, yet get introduced as experts when they blast their way through a podcast making claim after claim after claim that, to the real experts, makes one cringe with every point. The insidiousness of it comes because most listeners aren't experts in the field discussed, so they don't know what's right from wrong. Yet when experts listen to it, it's like misinformation carnage that only they can see, invisible blood and guts to those that have spent their career studying the topic, while everyone else is watching without the ability to see what's happening in front of them. Bit of a gruesome image, but it does feel that way, a bit like a horror story. It's especially destructive because it all happens within the domain of a pseudo-expert. And I should say domain. So the rules that I outlined previously don't have nearly the same applicability. usually I try to fact check people that I run across and create content on, which is why the Spotlight series exists. And I get flooded with requests asking for, hey, can you cover this person or that person? And I wish I could, but the rate at which people speak without needing to defend their claims is about 1 billion times faster than I can find studies, analyze each study, and then create content on it. The speed of misinformation is that of light, and the speed of information is that of sound. Now, of course, I'm also not an expert in every facet of nutrition and physiology because it's a growing journey for me too. But as I grow older and I have more time on my hands, aka some PhD obligations, I do expect my knowledge base to grow faster. But that still doesn't do that much, except, well, frustrate me more. That just means more podcasts, social media that will frustrate me because for you, I'm technically just another guy, unless I prove myself to you. That means I need to bring studies to back up my claims, and one step further, show you what the data says. That seems oddly familiar to me. Meanwhile, pseudo-experts get to keep talking without doing their due diligence because no one holds them accountable during their interviews. So, how can we change the podcast landscape for the better? Well, I'll mention something that I've been wrestling with for, I'd say, probably over a year now. And I'll offer some input on some people that I think are generally solid people to listen to that don't come with a side of corny jokes. If you've been with Physionic for a time, you know exactly what I mean. First, I've been thinking about my own podcast. It's generally been a solo podcast with me distilling my last 2 to 3 months of work into one episode. I have to admit, I really enjoy this format because one, I'm well versed on the topics I discuss because I analyze the studies from front to back. Additionally, I don't need to provide proof because, well, the content already exists, it's already available, so you can fact check me. Also, selfishly, I get to talk health science, my love, for 2 to 5+ hours uninterrupted. I know, the horror. I mean, you could accuse me of enjoying my own voice, and frankly, I don't give a damn. I am obsessed with discussing what I'm learning, and I'm going to keep doing it. But the greater issue is how to handle guests. I've had a few guests over the last 6 months or so, only one of which that I slightly disagree with, and I mentioned as much, which is really all that I care to do. Because the exchange of ideas is important so long as both sides get told. I was also discussing this with my dad, and if you've made it this far, I'd like your opinion here too. One of the unique aspects of physiology is really that it spans the entire body, many aspects of biology. So while I will never be a world expert in any one area, I do have the advantage of being knowledgeable in many areas at once. This was, by the way, completely by design. So I'm in a unique position to be able to push back where I feel it's necessary when I think that someone is being overzealous or misrepresenting some of the scientific points. That said, I'm also not perfect, and I never will be. But I do possess the ability to read many types of studies, so it might be worthwhile to have a format that's recorded in 2 parts. Part 1 would be an interview, relying on my knowledge at the time to push back if necessary. And then part 2 would be after I've requested the studies corroborating the guest's points and have had a chance to read through them myself to re-interview. Then I would upload both parts as one seamless podcast, almost as if the podcast self-corrects itself within the same episode. Now, keep in mind, I'm largely a one-man operation, and I can't be doing this every week, or let alone even every month. But I love the idea of a self-correcting podcast. It would be an immense amount of work, but unique and confidence-inspiring for the audience, assuming that you trust me, which in this day and age is a big ask. So, I guess, what do you think? All right, I've been talking long enough, but I did promise that I'd mention a few people who podcast very well. That said, I don't necessarily agree with everything that they say, but my disagreements tend to be minor and overly nerdy and nuanced. Overall, these people put out excellent content when they're interviewed, and they reference studies, and they reference the scientific process, and they're highly knowledgeable, and they self-correct when needed. One is Dr. Peter Attia. The guy is a powerhouse of knowledge and has definitely pushed back against guests when he feels that they overextend conclusions. Two is Dr. Lane Norton. If you're familiar with his work, you know that I've disagreed with Lane in the past, but in general, he's been a fantastic asset to putting out science-based podcast interviews. Three is Dr. Gil Carvalho. Gil is a wonderful teacher, far above the other two in my mind, although both Lane and Peter are also quite good. Gil, of course, is not only a gifted teacher, but has the credentials to back it up too. There are others, but those three will leave you in good hands. That said, I realize that you may disagree with one or all three for one reason or another, and that's perfectly fair to disagree. But keep in mind that these three tend to agree on 95% of things, which shows consistency across study-based science speakers. And having read some of the same studies that they have on the areas that I've analyzed, I tend to agree as well. Anyway, I have more to say on this topic and hope to release some form of, vetting process for the average person to be able to vet interviewees in my field a bit better and to avoid some of the pitfalls of nonsense podcasting. Who knows? Maybe you'll also see the carnage. I appreciate you sticking it out with me here, and I also appreciate your opinions, considering I'm pretty confident that you already gave me some. Thanks.